about to leave. Already packing, come with me.
Now we have Ashley Hanson, who, again, you just got the brief meeting during our during the conversation. I've seen Ashley a couple times present work at a Rural Arts Summit. I also was at a break during the Managing the American Conference in University of California, Davis, and I was like, that looks like a familiar person. I was like, oh yeah, it's Ashley. And it's like, there's somebody I know. So started talking to Ashley about coming out for the Symposium. She's also now participating with the Studio Arts in Jennifer Drinkwater's program. Her work, I think, also particularly for an interdisciplinary program is, and the sort of investigations and inquiries that we've been trying to develop through Launchpad course is like really something that goes out and happens in a particular place and is very unique to that place. So, I mean, every project is like entirely dependent, really, on like where it happens and how it happens. And when you're speaking of that long conversation, they're actually quite lengthy investigations and inquiries. So I know we were just talking about that conversation, that the first project that we did, people were talking about was a very quick one, and it was really just kind of opening a can of worms, hopefully, for you guys. So just to say real quickly that also Ashley has an MA in Applied Theater from the University of Manchester with emphasis on the role of theater in sustainable development of rural communities. That sounds pretty awesome to me. I'd say right there, okay, we got to get signed up and bring Ashley here. So with that, I'll hand it over to Ashley Hanson.
Thanks. Awesome. Before we start, I'm going to ask you to all stand up for a moment. Set down whatever you have in your hands. So my work puts people at the center of the practice. And just to remind us that, you know, we're here with a backstory. We're here for a reason. We came into this room, we came into this building, we came into this program, we came into this space because of a very specific path that led us here. So I'm just going to take a moment to close our eyes and breathe into your body and feel your feet on the ground. And just take a moment to think about that path that led you into this space. Whether it's the physical walking path that you took to get into this building or into this room, or the longer path that you took to make it to this university, to this program, to this city, to this state. And we're going to just breathe into that to remind us that we are here. So take a deep breath in and out. And in a moment, I'm going to ask you to open your eyes, but keep them closed. In a moment, I'm going to ask you to open your eyes and look around the room, and you're going to make eye contact with one other person, just the first person that your eyes touch with. And you're going to, when you make eye contact with that person, you know, it might be a little funny, it might be a little silly, it might be serious, but you're going to look at that person and just take a breath together, a breathe in and a breathe out. So the second part of my work is how we work in relationship to other people, remembering that they also had a journey and a path to get to where they are, and we have to meet them where they are at. So we're going to do that twice. You're going to look at one person, take a breath in, take a breath out. You're going to move your eyes around to another person, take a breath in, take a breath out. Once you've made eye contact with two different people and shared breath, then you can bring your eyes back up to this part of the room. Go ahead and open your eyes. It's okay to laugh. It's okay to smile. It's okay to be playful with your breath. If you see somebody whose eyes are wandering, try to find their eyes. Little funny, little awkward. It's okay to be playful with it. It's okay to be silly with it. So the shift in the room, the shift in the energy when you do little moments like that of connection is what I'm really interested in. So when we're talking about design, I really do feel like, I've said this already today, but I do feel a bit like an imposter in the traditional term, the traditional definition of the word design. So the way I want to think about design in this next 45 minutes is looking at designed experiences and how we interact with community and how we create projects that really are of a place, as Kevin mentioned, and are really made up of the people in it. So I'm a theater artist, primarily community engagement artist, and a theater artist, and I have a theater company called PlaceBase Productions, and we work with small towns to tell the history, stories, and potential futures of place by working with the people who live there to stage these stories in the places where they actually occurred. And before I dive into that part of the work, I just want to bring into the room these women. Excuse the fuzzy photos, but these are old photographs. I come from 5 generations of rural women, of rural badass women who have lived off the land and have gone through a lot of the trials and tribulations of rural life. We made it in the newspaper for being, this is me, for being 5 generations in northern Minnesota. And this is me just last summer with my mom and my grandmother and my great-grandmother's tree. She's no longer with us, but this is our land that we've had my great-grandmother and grandfather bought. And this is my dog. And these are the things that ground me in my work, is always having this touchstone of where I come from and the women, the lineage that I come from, and my dog, who makes me get up and go for a walk sometimes when I'm hunched over my computer for too long. So I started PlaceBase Productions with my good friend Andrew, who's here. We started this in 2010. As Kevin mentioned, I got my master's degree from the University of Manchester in applied theater, and that is the application of theater to a social issue, to life, to policy, whatever you wanted to apply the theater to. So I chose rural community development. And as I was doing this research, really figuring out that there's not a lot of, there wasn't a lot of literature at the time having to do specifically with rural communities in the Western world. There's a lot of theater for development in third world countries, but not necessarily like in the US, for theater for development. I'm speaking specifically of that. And so we started PlaceBase Productions to really look at cultivating stewards of community identity and connecting people to their common places, stories, and relationships. That's our mission statement, but we really mean that. How do we really nurture the culture of place, and how do we really celebrate and honor the culture of a place that already exists? I know there's a lot of people that in this field that have challenge with the word placemaking. I'm one of the people that have challenged with that word, that we're making a place, but instead that we're animating, activating, celebrating, honoring a place that already exists, and reconnecting people to that shared identity. And this is what we try to do through our work with PlaceBase Productions. So I'm going to talk a little bit about our methodology, but really through story, because that's more fun. And I also want to put at the center of all of this idea of play and the idea of playfulness, and how important it is to provide spaces to be playful, and to allow that. Playfulness really allows that space to take risks and to trust each other, which is a key element to theater, and which is kind of why I chose the tool of theater to do this kind of community organizing work. It's because there's room for play, this room for taking risk, and this room for trust. So our methodology has to do with, again, putting people at the center of the practice. We spend about a year working with a given community. This can be a geographic community, a community of circumstance, a community of interest, but right now we're primarily working in geographic communities, small towns, population 15,000 or less. Our research involves just a lot of hanging out and chatting with people. We do a ton of one-on-ones, getting to go into people's homes, learning about their rock collections, going into schools and doing story circles in schools. This is the mayor of a little town of New London in Minnesota. with a map that we've hand-drawn and walked around the city with the mayor, asking people about significant places in town, so a kind of different, we call it a memory map, a different kind of mapping of just like, where did you have your first kiss? Where did your son... not necessarily like this is where the founding father had the first bank, but more just about like what makes up the life and the veins of this community. We do something called story swaps, which are similar to story circles, but a little bit less formal in the traditional format of a story circle, where we, again, hang out, we sit in a circle, and then we swap stories. We just share stories about, yes, about the history of the place, but also about some of the current challenges, the current the culture, the like tensions that exist, but then like a lot about what we celebrate. What are the rituals and traditions and the heart of this place? What is the character that makes up this place? And part of this, I say like we just spend this time hanging out, but the act of hanging out is where we really learn about the character of a given place. So it's less about when this town was founded, and more about how people interact with each other that helps to inform then what becomes our script, which is an original musical based on this year of research. So if a town has a really big heart, like everyone who lives there just really loves being from there, that's the approach that we take to our script writing. It's like, okay, this place really loves itself. Like this play has to have a lot of love in it. Or on the other side of it, it's like, this place feels really sad right now. It's really heavy. Maybe what this place needs is a big injection of hope. So let's just put a ton of hope into this theater production. And then as we move forward through the writing process, as we develop the character of this place and we start to research these significant spaces, we work with the community to actually stage the show. It's very much a moving process. So we have a script, yes, we have the songs, yes, but as we get the people in the room who make up the cast, this stuff starts to meld and shape, and we decide maybe this scene should be a group of clowns. Maybe we should have a giant oyster that is a person. And we just start to be playful with each other, be imaginative in that space. The cast in each of our productions is made up of the local community. Between 50 and 100 people make up a production. And the play itself is staged, again, in these significant spaces around the town or the place that we're working. I'll go into a little bit more detail as we go through the different projects. But throughout the auditions, rehearsals, recording of the music, creating and staging these scenes together, the performance and the evaluation, we have as much involvement of the local community as possible. We have local artists working on the set, local sound engineers working with us on all of the recording processes, local musicians integrated into each step of the process. So it's just myself and a playwright, and then, our company becomes the company that we are around. I talk a lot about just how we think about this process, and really the 4 pillars that we really use as we think about each of the stages is having deep trust for the community that we're working with, the people that we're working with. Everyone has the capability to do whatever it is that we decide we're going to do together. We have compassion for, this isn't up here, this is just something else, but the compassion for the place, compassion for the geography, compassion for the people and the life experiences that they come into the room with. We provide a space for that playfulness, that risk-taking, and that joy to come out together, and we provide a space for celebration where we can reflect on what we've done and we can really celebrate what we've done and celebrate our accomplishments. It's something that I feel like our country specifically is not very good at, taking that time to just step back and say, God, we did this together. This is really awesome. So there's these things about finding partners and defining the parameters that you're creating with, but what it really is about in this initial phase of research is listening and then deeply listening. So you're listening to what people are saying in your interviews, you're listening to what's happening at the bar, you're listening to the story swaps that are being, the stories that are being shared with you. But then the next level down of deeply listening to what's in between the lines, deeply listening to what connections are being made, deeply listening to how the past relates to the current situation and how that impacts whether or not people are going to be involved in their civic realm, whether or not they want to be invested in the future of their place. So looking at the layers beneath what's actually being said and how it's being said. So this is our very first show we ever did. It's called Granite Falls, a Meandering River Walk. And this was, we were asked to come to the town of Granite Falls, population 2,800, to celebrate this new river walk that was put in as kind of a flood mitigation plan. No one was using this river walk, even though it was a space to get connected to the water. So it was about a quarter-mile long, the stage that we were working with, and we had 6 different scenes along this quarter-mile stretch of the river walk. And I'm just going to point out one character here. This is Dave Smigluski. He's the mayor of Granite Falls, playing one of the founding fathers of Granite Falls. So Granite Falls, after this initial production, Meandering River Walk, looking at 11,000-year history in 1 hour was how we framed this show. So we went all the way back geologic history up to the current day. And then following the production, 1 month later, part of our process then is to come back and do an evaluation session. And this evaluation session isn't just like an hour where we come together and do surveys. We spend an entire day, again, celebrating what we've accomplished. We watch a video of the production. We always film our productions. So we can come back together and say, oh gosh, look at this amazing thing we created together. What's next? So we spend a lot of time in that evaluative space, in that brainstorming space of looking at the people who came together to make something like this happen and moving forward, what are we going to do next with this energy? And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But in this particular case, following the Granite Falls Meandering River Walk play, we got together for our evaluation session and said, it was great to get people down by the river, but one of our challenges is that no one actually utilizes this amazing asset that we have in our community. People aren't actually getting on the river. So what if we, which is one of my favorite games to play, just what if we, which I said earlier too, just go around the room and say, what if we, and the sky's the limit. What if we put a play on the river? So our second play with Granite Falls was a paddling theater production called With the Future on the Line, which looked at 3 different towns that were battling for the county seat at the kind of turn of the century. And we worked with Wilderness Inquiry, which is an organization that gets people outside, out on the water, to set up these Voyager canoes, and the canoes became the audience. So again, getting people outside of the traditional theater box and getting folks on the river to actually use the river, learn about the ecology of the place. This here is a song that includes all 36 of the mussel species that exist in the Minnesota River. So it's like this really fun, silly song about mussels. But again, talking about the local ecology, talking about the history, talking about the struggles that small towns go through, whether or not they're going to survive or not, while just being out on the water with your community. So they had such a great time with that production, they invited us back for a third show. This is our Granite Falls trilogy. And this production was actually on Main Street. And it's called Granite Falls Saturday Night. So oftentimes when we're working in towns of this size, there's a lot of talk about what happened in the 40s and 50s, kind of the heydays of these communities where everyone would come to town on Saturday nights, drive their cars up and down the road, park, watch people go by. Why doesn't that happen anymore? This kind of nostalgia for this era of this golden era. So we didn't want to dwell on that nostalgia, but we wanted to look at it and ask the questions of, if the infrastructure is still here, the population hasn't declined, what else has changed? And if we've done it before, can we do it again? And that was kind of the premise of Granite Falls Saturday Nights, where we staged different scenes up and down Main Street. This here, again, is Dave Smigluski, the mayor of Granite Falls. I'm just going to point him out here playing a bartender in this show. So bouncing between kind of story and the methodology component of it. When we go into our rehearsal process where we're getting folks involved in the actual production, we really think deeply about authentic involvement, not just to check boxes, but like how can we really immerse ourselves in this place, and how can we really allow the people who are being a part of our process to impact us and shift our process. And that it goes back to this idea of compassion and love, and actually falling in love with the place and falling in love with the people that you're working with. And if you do that in your design process, that is going to set you apart from every other person in the room, right? You're actually falling in love with the people and the place that you're working with. It means that your work is a lot harder and a lot longer and sometimes even a lot lonelier. And it means that the exit process is also sometimes harder because you've developed this really strong connection. But that's also the way that the work can be more impactful and really have a lasting impact. With that love and with that compassion, one of the things we just say over and over and over again is no experience necessary, no experience necessary. You do not have to have any experience to be a part of this process any step of the way. And there's this struggle between, or conflict between quality and artistic quality and like involvement, and we're always on the end of involvement and bringing people along for the journey, and the process of what it means to watch somebody develop from having no experience at all to being the star of a show, whether or not like a critic would say that they were an amazing performer, is not of interest to us. It's more about that development of the individual person and how we invite them into the process. So just thinking about that as you're like designing your community engagement strategies of how you can remove as many barriers as possible to make sure that message is very clear, that you don't need any experience to be a part of it if your goal is authentic involvement. Another show, performance that I just want to highlight here is called the Kirkbride Cycle. So there's a former regional treatment center in Fergus Falls, Minnesota, which is a town of about 13,000 people. It's 800,000 square foot building, kind of a castle on the hill that was built in the late 1800s that at its time housed over 2,000 residents that were for mental health care. And this building has had a lot of, it's been vacant for since about 2009, and has been off and on the proverbial chopping block in the city. The city currently owns it. It's a huge conflict within the community whether or not they want to keep it and maintain it. There's an organization there called Springboard for the Arts that has brought artists on board for the last 4 years, to activate the space and get people talking about what else can this be. So the Kirkbride Cycle is a show that we put together in 2014. There was a group in town that was a couple of different partners in town that were thinking about creating bike paths around this beautiful campus. And so again, working with the existing initiatives in the community, we thought, okay, if we're going to do this play up on this campus, what if we put our audience on bicycles and get people just like out there experiencing the campus on bikes? If this might be a potential outcome for this campus to become have bike paths through it, let's try sampling that out and getting people used to that. So the Kirkbride Cycle had stages all around this 800,000 square foot building with the audience moving from scene to scene on bicycles. The play was one day. We did it 3 times, and we saw 600 people, 600 audience members on bikes. They decorated their bikes. There was lots of moments of engagement during the production where you could actually put forth ideas for what you wanted the space to be, fill out different forms, and engage with the performers in different ways. Here is Hal Leland, the mayor of Fergus Falls. The former mayor of Fergus Falls when we were doing the show here. And then this next show, Paddle on the Pond in New London, Minnesota, town of 1,200. This town is situated around this beautiful mill pond, again, this kind of underutilized, beautiful asset to this community. I have a short video, it's just about 3 minutes long, about this production, and I'm going to let the cast of Paddle on the Pond tell you a little bit more about this show. And as you're listening to the video, just pay attention to when in the process, as people are talking about the process, it shifts from them, referring to me and Andrew, like they came in, they did this, to we.
The whole process started in the research of and collecting of all these stories that were presented today.
Well, they started over a year ago having meetings here. Story swaps is what they were called.
Finding out about the history of the town, and so then it was just a lot of research for them, and
invited people in to come tell their stories about their experiences in New London or their relatives or the stories they had heard. And I had heard the famous ones, the smokestack falling over of the mill and the dynamite in the pool hall. The pie eating contest might have been a little embellished.
a lot of the same themes started coming up. And so we started piecing together what seemed like it would be a really cool story to tell. And
Compiled them all and put them into a play, wrote some music, and let us have fun with it.
The ground is dark and fertile, there's a mill in every town, in this lavish land of infinite supply.
As you're teaching people about their history, creating really great opportunities for social interaction, I feel like that brings the community closer together and helps us have a more vibrant and strong place to live.
What a day,
Heading to the pond for
what a day,
gonna win that fishing contest.
what a
The fact that
day.
everyone was moving across the pond, they got to see all these different spots, which was fun for people who are from New London and maybe haven't really journeyed out there that much.
really cool to do something outside and not confined by a little stage space.
More boats than I have ever seen on this pond and most small lakes.
Like Kelly Clarkson.
I mean, it was a moment to remember for other people too. That it's an experience of the moment. So the memory's gonna go on.
I think it's kind of indicative of the willingness that people have to participate in something like this. And I think people are in this community and really all over are hungry to learn about their history and to have opportunities to interact with their community, and feel like this is just a really unique way to allow that to happen. So
Yeah, the result was awesome. It was. I kept thinking of Ashley and Andrew as artists, and we were their brushes. We were kind of just filling out their canvas as it was going along, and it was fun to be a part of their artwork like that.
Just reminds me how great a place it is, how many talented people we have here, and really how many hands can make something really large and meaningful come together.
Full of men and women, joyful and merry, they put their shovels in the ground.
So, going back to this idea of space for reflection and celebration, as I mentioned before, about a month after each of our productions, we come back and do this brainstorming session. But we really look at reflection throughout the process. So how do we reflect what's happening in the community? How do we reflect the character of the place? How do we reflect during the process consistently, checking ourselves, checking where we're at, checking our agendas, making sure that what we're doing really benefits the place itself and not ourselves. As we come back to the actual reflection and brainstorming part of the process, one of the things we always talk about in that space is about the people who are in the room, these 50, 60, 70 people who helped create this crazy production together, staged it all around this mill pond. When we first came to town, everyone said, this is impossible. You'll never get, we can't get anybody to audition for the play. You'll never get everybody out there. You'll never get people out on boats. And then, 126 people plus 100 people on the shorelines come out for this show. And it's like, well, maybe if we try, we can. So you're in this room with 50 other people who took this risk, who created something from nothing, who took the chance to connect with each other and connect with this place. These are the people that you can rely on to make the next thing happen. So you want to start an ice cream parlor, or you want to get a bunch of people together to go to the city council meeting to advocate for something that you believe in. These are the people that are going to be with you on that process. So we do a lot of asking cast members to invite people over for dinner from the cast that they didn't know beforehand, maintaining those relationships, maintaining those connections outside of the rehearsal room and outside of the space. The mantra that we use for this part of the process, trust me, trust yourself, have fun. So during as we get closer to the play and we're about to go into like a dress rehearsal and we're all standing in the circle. How many of you have been in a play before? Okay, so that like feeling, that family feeling that you get. We just love that. And right before we're about to go out on stage and we're about to go do something like this, crazy together, we turn to our neighbor and say, trust me. And we turn to our other neighbor and we say, trust yourself. And then we yell at the top of our lungs, have fun. And I think like just saying those three things over and over in community, like you can trust me, you can trust yourself, and we can have fun together, opens up a lot of different doors and a lot of different possibilities. Again, I have on here just believe in the power of play and how it connects us to each other and to the places that we work. This is another play in a town called Appleton. It's another 1,200 person play. Just showing some more of different scene locations, different ages involved. And this show is called This Land is My Land, in a town of 360 people. So very, very small town. Our audience was 250 people, and we had 50 people in the show. So that's 300 people in a town of 360 people for the show. So just the kind of involvement that happens here. I'm going to play one more very short clip. This is about a 2-minute clip from one of our cast members talking about the experience of working on This Land is My Land.
I don't remember when exactly I just decided to just go check it out. So I went to that audition and I got there, and it's just that kind of like, you start feeling that energy of something's about to happen. So I ended up being a man in this thing. It was so great. I got to wear a beard, and I got to try to make everybody scared of sea monsters.
There's a sea monster in Lockheed Park.
It was a blast, and it was really fun to do it with having kids involved in it and getting them jazzed up about an art and performance and understanding all of the things that go into that and being just fearless about, learning dances and trying new things. And seeing the kids from both of the cultures in the town just, mixing so freely. I mean, it was just like a non-issue, even though we know in town there is a little friction with that. And that one young girl who does that song behind me while I'm being the pain in the butt guy, and she gets up and she sings, and there's this angel voice coming out of her.
What on earth is a sea monster anyway? That sounds kinda crazy to me.
And what an opportunity for her to understand the potential that she has and to be nurtured and encouraged. So yeah, and you know, when you hear everybody here talking about what we could do next with this, I think that's what they were really all about from the beginning. It wasn't doing this one thing and walking away. It was saying, you've been energized, now what are you going to do? You're all together, you bonded, you know each other, you've met each other's kids. We can do anything.
Let's put this sea monster back where it belongs and talk about what's really on our minds.
The people that are in this room are the community that's going to continue to make change. What Carol was talking about, so Milan has undergone a cultural shift over the last 10 years. New immigrant community from Micronesia has moved in and makes up about half of the population of the town. And there's a lot of fear and misunderstanding. And one of the themes throughout our show then became about this sea monster, which we talked about. There was a legend that there was a sea monster in Lac qui Parle, which is the lake near Milan. And no one really understood it, and everyone was afraid of the lake, and there was all of these stories and myths and things like blowing up and blowing out of proportion about the sea monster. And so we really used that metaphor throughout the show to talk about these cultural differences and this lack of understanding between the two cultures as being fear. At the end of the play, we have an actual sea monster come out, this gigantic sea monster come out, and attack this 80s prom scene. It's absolutely ridiculous. But there is something that the audience doesn't get to know. Something that we do with the cast is we did this whole workshop with our 50 cast members about fear and about the fear that exists in our community and why we think that fear exists. And we took a marker and wrote all of those fears down on the teeth of the sea monster. And then in that same workshop, we talked about what are things that we can do to overcome those fears as individuals in our community. What are our tools? What are the kinds of things that we can do to bridge those gaps and bridge those differences? And we had these cardboard swords, and everybody got to make their own cardboard sword. And they wrote what they would do to overcome that fear, really small, on their cardboard swords. So when the sea monster attacked the 80s prom scene that the whole cast was in, they all grab out their cardboard swords and they run and charge the sea monster and they defeat it. It's this really, silly moment. But for the cast that was involved, this very symbolic, metaphorical, we can come together, we can use our strengths and our tools that we have with us to defeat our fears. So finding those ways to really incorporate what's happening in the community in these productions. For the last 10, 15 minutes of what I'm going to talk about here, I'm going to shift gears a little bit. But before I do, I just wanted to see if anybody had any specific questions or any thoughts or ideas about how this kind of methodology or this kind of practice is applicable to you and the work that you do.
I just like the idea of going to the town and really becoming a member of the community before you start doing anything. And that's really applicable for design almost what we were just talking about, how you kind of want to take it to action mode, not just okay, I got a checklist here and then mark off a few things, and you actually take the time to get to know them. Then you'll kind of realize what about the community makes them what about the people what they really want, so that you're not just giving them something that they won't really understand.
So you might look at a piece of land and say, wouldn't this be a great amphitheater? And then you have this idea in your mind, but it's oh, we already have it, we don't need that, or so yeah, exactly. Back there?
In the new foundation studio that we're working on, we've been doing a lot of theatrical warm-ups as a way to get people to move into ideation more easily, and it really works. And it seems like your whole thing is the drama theater warm-up. Can you talk about that a little more?
For sure.
What's the mechanism?
Yeah, you guys want to do that? Maybe after lunch.
Why is it so much more sophisticated than brainstorming?
believe it's because it gets us out of our minds and into our bodies, and it gets us acting from this more like playful space, this like reactionary playful space where we're just, something's coming at us and we have to respond rather than overthinking it. We're programmed from the beginning of school, right? That is the right answer, and we have to get it right, and we have to, think really hard about it before we speak. And what the idea of the theater warm-up, whether it's just getting in your body or if we're doing zip, zap, zop, or we're just like flying, this energy around the space as quick as we possibly can, you don't have time to overthink it, and you act on your feet, you respond in the moment, and you laugh. You get to be playful. And I think just like allowing that in your body to come first, and it opens up, it gets rid of that critic, the critical mind that we have, which I think is why improv is always, it's the scariest thing in the world. As a theater artist, I'm like so afraid of improv. But once I do a few improv activities and exercises, and then like going into a brainstorming session, it's like, oh God, this is so easy. It's so much easier to like spit ideas around than to like create a scene on the spot. So I think it loosens up those muscles and gets us like into that more visceral place. Does that answer your question? Yeah. Cool. Okay, so now that I've kind of talked about the methodology we use in PlaceBase, I'm just going to buzz through a few other projects. You can just apply all of these same methodologies to how we got to a different end, but I'm going to move us out of theater into a few different other spaces. So working in small towns around Minnesota, as soon as the 2016 election happened, hearing a lot of kind of sweeping statements about rural and urban divides and why people voted a certain way, and stereotypes and stigmas that exist on this idea of there being sides. I wanted to see how other practitioners working in rural communities were addressing some of these challenges. So I bought this little yellow school bus named Gus, and took off on a road trip for about 6 weeks, visiting towns with 10,000 or less to interview artists working in these communities. And again, this process of inquiry. I didn't have an idea of what I wanted to come out of this. I just wanted to ask questions. I just wanted to say, hey, I'm a practitioner doing this work, and I'm feeling these things. Are you feeling them too? And how do we address them? I mentioned earlier this idea of like the feminist lens in looking at designing an experience. And when we think often about, traveling across the country, whether you like look at, Jack Kerouac or on the road or something like that, there's this idea of like conquering or like going out to like have this experience for myself and like, and just like flipping that into it being like an experience of story and really honoring the other person and not even, being there to like be a sounding board rather than to like, this is for me and my self-gratification. And one of the things with that is like, and maybe you'll hear a little bit more about this later in the afternoon presentations, but when I was telling people I was going on this trip, instead of people saying like, so where are you stopping? Where are you going? Why are you doing this? What I heard was, aren't you scared? Aren't you afraid? Are you bringing a gun? These questions, I was like, would you say this if I was a man? Would you ask me that? Would that be the first question that comes out of your mouth is, are you afraid? So I started thinking a lot about that in the process of how I was going into these spaces as a woman and what that brought with it. This is the route that we took, and I invited 3 different artists to join me, female artists to join me for different stretches of the trip. And then we each created different pieces based on our experience for an exhibition that is now kind of a mobile exhibition, which will be going up at Rush Hall this weekend. These are the 3 artists that came with me, Randy, Ellie, and Hannah. And at each of the stops, I invited the artist that I was speaking with to provide me with an artifact that represented their community or their work. So here I'm at the Old Jail Art Center in Albany, Texas, town 1,200 people with an art collection of masterpieces, over 2,500 unbelievable masterpieces in this small town. So they provided me with a key to the old jail cell. And I also invited each of the hosts to write a letter to the next stop. So I told them where I was going, and they would handwrite a letter which I would deliver to the next stop. And this kind of hope of connecting these, sometimes feeling this like isolated practice, connecting these practitioners across the country with each other, saying, hey, you're not alone, I'm here, I'm 400 miles away doing the good hard work as well. Maybe you want to come visit sometime. This is just a short clip of a project in Denmark, South Carolina, and I'll just let them talk for themselves about this project and kind of looking at this idea of placemaking and resources and access in rural communities. Oops, back.
Yeah, no, you're good? Yeah, you sure? It freaks people out. So within a couple of minutes, I mean, you guys
is translated into art, into a 2- or 3-dimensional space, and how it can continue the conversation as like static object, and how story and performance can be a part of these kinds of static objects. So we have the artifacts that I mentioned before on display here, which each had like a story or a quote that comes along with it. You've got this father and son are listening to quotes with earphones from the different spaces while flipping through photographs as you would in kind of like, you know, in your grandmother's attic kind of vibe. But then with each of putting the exhibition in the space that isn't one of the tour stops, you know, inviting people in to talk about these issues within their own community and connecting it to the place is a really important part of this exhibition, which we'll be able to do here as well in Des Moines, involving more local artists in this conversation as well. I wanted to also just like kind of touch upon some of the urban work that I've done around this kind of engagement, community engagement processes. And I'm also mindful of time, so I don't know if you want me to pause here or, am I okay? Okay, and we started a little bit later. I was selected as an artist in residence for the city of Minneapolis, which is, they have an initiative called Creative City Making, where they embed artists in the long-term planning department of the city. And we worked with this wonderful dude named Jim Vole, and I don't know if this is going to work. It will work, great. Who was a planner that really was not super interested in, he didn't have a lot of tools or experience in community engagement, so he was super excited to work with us to go out onto this Penn Avenue, which is a thoroughfare in North Minneapolis, to talk about transportation and access to transportation. And so we worked with local community groups to create a series of different engagement strategies. So rather than me and the artist I was working with, Wing, coming in and saying, we want to do this kind of engagement, we partnered with different community groups to say, what kinds of engagement strategies would work in your community? How about that? So ping pong was a big deal in this particular stretch of road, and so we set up ping pong tables in different storefronts on the sides of streets, and asked people to write a question that they wanted to know from their neighbor about their community, about safety, access, livability, housing, some of the like huge topics that we were meant to cover. And then all of these ping pong balls went into a bowl, and as people came up on the street, they would pick up a ping pong ball, read the question that was written on the ping pong ball from one of their neighbors, and then have a conversation about that question while they had a game of ping pong on the street. And then write their responses on chalkboard, which we took photos of. You can see some examples here. We also did something called the 6-word story, Hemingway's 6-word story. So we asked people to describe their community in 6 words and put them up on clotheslines all around town. So just these little snippets and snapshots. And then this one up here is bus stop theater. So again, talking about bus stops. We wanted to explore this idea of transportation and access to transportation. So after we had done this whole series of engagements over the course of about 8 months, we took all of the data, like the raw data of like what people wrote on their chalkboards, what we were hearing in these different story circles, what we were hearing on the streets, what we were hearing from this Bus Stop Jeopardy was another engagement that we came up with the community group. It's called City Making Jeopardy, where we just would wheel up this kind of silly-looking Jeopardy board to a bus stop, and people would say housing for 400, and we'd flip it over and then ask them a question about housing and have this exchange. So we took all of this raw data and handed it over to a playwright who wrote a play based on this data, and we created scenes that were exactly as long as it took for a bus to come. So the audience boarded the bus, went to the first bus stop, got off, watched a scene that was 11 minutes long, and then boarded the next bus that came to pick up at that stop. And we moved down the road watching 11-minute scenes at a time to get really acquainted with the space, looking out the windows at the space in this kind of way of like interacting and learning about the history and stories and feelings about each of these places while actually using public transportation to get from scene to scene, and like, oh, the bus is late, or shoot, the bus came early, and now we have to end the scene early and quick run on the bus, and like how these systems actually work in practice, and then have a big conversation about it at the end. So again, just ways of like thinking about if we're gonna talk about bus stops, if we're gonna talk about transportation, how do we get people like on and in and using these different systems so we can really talk about it in context. And we did a similar thing with Green Line Theater, which was a light rail that came through Minneapolis, where we had different scenes happen along the Green Line. And briefly just wanted to touch base as we were talking about entrepreneurship. This is another company that I started with 2 of my girlfriends called Curious Incidents. And Curious Incidents designs events. We design spaces for connection and interaction using arts and creativity and joy and play to help people connect. And so this is one of our projects called, it was called Welcome Hat. So in Minnesota, as in with here, right, it's just so cold in the winters. And when newcomers and people move to the city, we did a little bit of research working with an organization called Greater MSP. And the 2 reasons why people move out of Minneapolis is the weather, and they have a hard time breaking in. This idea of Minnesota nice, where nice, we give you directions anywhere but to our home, anywhere. So it's like, you'll never get invited over for dinner. So we wanted to address both of those issues with this idea of these welcome hats. So we designed these events. This was actually a concept by an artist named Junli Wong, and she worked with us to design the events. They're seasonal events, and in each of the 4 times a year, people come together and learn about different organizations and entities and groups and events happening in town that they can really connect with. We do lots of different things, like with passports and bingo cards and getting people moving through the space in fun, exciting ways. But we also hand out these hats. And the hope is with these hats that if you see anybody else on the street wearing this exact same hat, they are also a newcomer. So it's open. The event's open to anybody that's lived in the cities for 2 years or less. And so, yes, we'll give you this hat, but there's a social contract that we're signing together by receiving this hat, that if you see anybody else wearing this hat, you need to go up and say hello. And this exchange kind of permeates throughout the city. We also trained folks called Minnesota Nice Breakers. There are these ambassadors here. And trained is a loose word, but we held these series of gatherings where we talked about, ways of connecting with people in spaces, both like in an event, already existing event space, but also just out on the streets, and held these micro meetup events where we'd kind of infiltrate like a book club that was already happening at a bar, but we would send in our nice breakers to just like help people be friends with each other, essentially, and make friends with each other. And the last project that I'll touch upon is one that I'm currently working on, again, thinking about how to work within a specific given community and what needs are there that can be addressed through engagement. So this is an organization called called the Southwest Minnesota Housing Partnership, which works with affordable housing in rural communities in southwestern Minnesota. And their staff was having, they wanted to engage a resident artist to deal with some of the issues that was going on internally in their organization, some issues with communication, with workload, and not being able to connect with their colleagues. And so one of the things, initially, I'm the resident artist there right now, they're like, okay, these folks spend a lot of time on the road because they're working with communities all across this gigantic region. So you have this time in the car and you're not connecting with each other. So one of the projects that came out of that idea was creating a podcast series where it's just interviewing each of the staff members about their life off the clock. The podcast series is called Off the Clock. So I just went and talked to all 26 of the staff members and just said, you meet me somewhere that makes you happy and we can talk about anything but work. And we talked for about an hour, and I condensed these into about 15-minute podcasts, and the staff can then download the podcasts and listen to them as they're driving from place to place to get to know their colleagues better in that space. Other little interventions like having Mary come, who you'll hear from later today, and shake things up with the staff. Happy hours, which is just something that they just don't do. It's just like you need this like outside instigator to come in and like, hey, let's all go out for a drink. And then just simple things like transforming an office space from a more like cubicle space into this creativity clubhouse, where it's just like a place to come and chill out and connect and share, just talk. So flipping some of this idea of office culture on its head. So. This is a lot to just kind of download on you in terms of like what these different engagement strategies, but again, I wanted to just come back to those key points of compassion and trust and play and love and how we can find spaces for that in our engagement work, in our work with community, in our work with the process, in our work with place, and even in our work with the materials that we're using and helping to inform our design process. So thanks for letting me kind of take you on a journey outside of from the house to the home, and how we look at and work with design and with community. So thank you. Quickly, do you know why we clap? Do you know where that comes from? Okay, so in ancient Greek theater, the clapping was a way of clearing the energy of the space. So when a scene was done, we would clap so that the next story could start, and everything that happened in that story before is gone. So we just like cleared the space with that clap. Can we do that one more time because it feels good? Okay.
We're about to leave. Already packing, come with me. I'm not really asking. We'll get away to a place where we don't know.